One of the points of debate now is whether Russia's actually on an offensive. I've declared on this channel that they are. And what I've said is that, well, Russia's offensive was never going to look like a World War II blitzkrieg. It wasn't going to look like full scale ahead. Russia has 400, 500, 600,000 troops. Ukraine has maybe a third of that, maybe less than that. And Russia's just going to steamroll them, run them over, take over Kiev. That was never going to be in the cards, because that would lead to unnecessary deaths on all sides, but especially on the Russian side. And Russia, remember, early on with the offensives that Ukraine was able to wage, despite the fact that they wasted all the ammunition and artillery and HIMARS missiles and all of the equipment that they received and all the equipment that they had, they wasted it all on these offensives. But they did cause damage, because Russia did, maybe, I wouldn't say miscalculate, but didn't go into this thinking it was going to get to that point. Because now we know that back in April, they were hoping to sign off on a peace deal and be done. They were ready March and April to have negotiated this. We know that Russia was ready to negotiate this into a peace deal, into some kind of agreement in December, before any hostilities had occurred. So Russia was ready to do that. And of course, the collective West, NATO, the United States, and then Ukraine's regime, they were not willing to do that. They didn't want to. They were never serious. And now we know about what the Minsk Accords were all about. The Minsk Accords were not about any kind of peace or ceasefire, or actually reining in and pulling back Ukraine's forces from shelling and causing just the utmost disastrous conditions in the Donbass. But it was really about buying time so Ukraine could prepare for a possible confrontation with Russia, for a proxy war with Russia through the Donbass, by taking over that territory and really taking over the entire east of Ukraine, getting Crimea back from the post-coup referendum, all of that, right? That's what the Minsk Accords were really all about. So Russia was ready to negotiate that, maybe because they were more ready to have a politically desirable outcome. They didn't immediately send everything they had at Ukraine immediately. And even now, after this partial mobilization, and even despite the fact that they are making immense gains in Bakhmut, we know Soledar was taken, now we got Vuhledar and all of these territories. Zaporozhye is currently experiencing some heavy fighting with Russia making advances. So even with all of that, there's a debate happening. Is this an offensive, or is this just maybe some minor reconnaissance? Is this just kind of testing the waters? And one of the best points I've heard is that Russia hasn't even sent out its partial mobilization yet. All of these forces doing the fighting now and making gains are forces that existed on the battlefield before the partial mobilization was even called. So we're waiting still for this 200, 300, 400,000 man mobilization, this military mobilization, to be deployed in some kind of way. And I believe that that will never be in a fashion that's just going to run over and bulldoze Ukraine's forces. I don't think that's going to happen, because first, I do still think that Russia wants a politically desirable settlement to this. They don't want to see even a plurality, if not a major number of their forces die on the battlefield. I still do think that Russia doesn't believe it's worth that. But what Russia does believe is that it's totally worth it to continue to degrade Ukraine's forces and complete the objectives, no matter what. So I don't think that there's any question about that. That's why I call it an offensive, because Russia now understands that it has to go as hard as it can to achieve its objectives. It's just that it doesn't have to send out its 100,000, 200,000, 300,000 mobilization just yet, because the strikes are working and because the forces that they have out there now are working. It's having a positive effect without dragging thousands upon thousands of Russian troops into a slaughter, which is what the United States and NATO would ultimately like. They would like that, because it would also give them the appearance of some kind of victory. So I've been hearing really good arguments that this isn't really a full-scale offensive. But I wanted to play Colonel Douglas Macgregor here, because I do think what he says, well, later in the program, he gets on, they talk about Steve Bannon, and, they have this kind of cultural war, conversation in some respects. He gave an interview on The Redacted, though, about a piece he recently wrote, and I found it to be interesting because what he says about Russia's mobilization and what he says about where Russia is at and what's going to happen, I think closely match what I think. And I think this is where the convergence and this interesting convergence between various forces on the left, you could say, and on the right are coming together to understand, I think, that there is an objective reality here. And the objective reality is that, yeah, Russia's never going to just slaughter Ukraine. It's not just going to burn Ukraine, but what it's going to do is it's going to be methodical, and it's going to take out Ukraine's forces in a manner that is escalatory. It's not going to look the same. It's not going to be just a tap on the shoulder. It will get worse and worse, but it won't be a situation where you see Russia throw out everything it has at Ukraine like the United States and NATO did to Ukraine in those offensives back 6 months ago, 8 months ago. It's not going to do that. And so I find that point really interesting and really important because it's going to inform, I think, what we have to look at when it comes to the panic of the neocons. I think the panic of the neocons and their Ukraine project is palpable right now because they know that this strategy is going to work. They know it's going to work. They know it's going to have the desired effect. They know that it's already degrading Ukraine's forces and that Ukraine's forces are having a big trouble now in even just keeping up with and maintaining all these territories that are part of this defense line that are not even being attacked by all of what Russia has. So Russia is not even throwing everything that it has or even this partial mobilization at it, and yet they're still gaining territory. They're still breaking down this defense line, and that's why the neocons are panicking. But now Douglas Macgregor is about to comment. He had just commented on NATO, recently made a comment. NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg recently made a comment about how NATO is ready to fight Russia. They're ready for a confrontation. And you heard this with Germany saying, we need to fight Russia. That's what we're doing. We got to fight Russia. You heard that from a German foreign minister. Now you're hearing it from NATO's general secretary that they're ready to fight Russia. And Colonel Douglas Macgregor was like, no, he was an advisor to Donald Trump's National Security Council, to his DOD. He was an advisor to Donald Trump in this respect. So he knows the U.S.'s capabilities quite well. And he had to say, absolutely not. The United States cannot get into this. But now he's going to talk about this idea that Russia is about to, or is waging an offensive, and what that may look like and what is the significance of this. So let's listen in here. And there'll be periodic pauses for some commentary.
So in your piece, you talk about the readiness right now. And I like how you start. You say, this time it's different, that somehow they're telling us that it's going to be different. And NATO is not prepared to do this. We're running out of ammunition. Where do you think NATO goes from here? It sounds like, and if you listen to this admiral talking, we need a wartime economy. He says that we need to turn our factories into military production machines right now because our stocks are drying up and we're going to take Russia head on. We need to convert factories in all of these NATO countries and go all out for a full-blown head-on collision with Russia.
Well, it's useful to keep in mind that in Russia, the manufacturing facilities for military equipment and weapons and ammunition are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Russia's already mobilized and integrated 300,000. The possibility that they will bring in more is very, very likely. I don't dispute that, because every time the Russians look to us and indicate a willingness to talk, we make it abundantly clear that the Russians have a choice. They can either completely withdraw from Ukraine or commit suicide. That's not necessarily a good starting point for negotiations. So the Russians are doing what you would expect them to do. They're getting ready for a much larger fight if necessary. This is something we're not prepared for. No one in Europe is prepared for this. We're not prepared to mobilize anybody in Western Europe. The only people who've mobilized soldiers at all to this point are the Poles. And the Poles are courageous people. There's no question about it. I think the notion of going to war with Russia at this stage is idiotic, but they also don't have the most modern equipment and capabilities that we do. So even though they can provide numbers, they're not necessarily capable of augmenting us. And we have at most 50,000 combat troops in Europe. At most, we have 100,000 soldiers in Europe, but that doesn't mean combat soldiers. That just means soldiers. In terms of those people that carry the fight to the enemy, that close with and destroy the enemy, that launch rockets, missiles, and ammunition at the enemy, no, we've only got 50,000. We're now looking at a force in and around Ukraine of what, 700,000 plus, with the potential to go close to 1 million, and new plans to permanently expand the Russian military establishment, especially the army. This is all crazy nonsense. We ought to stop talking about it. We need to get back to understanding the Ukrainians are losing badly. They're taking horrific casualties. They're crumbling down in southern Russia, and the Russians have yet to launch their major offensives.
So, I mean, the first point he made is that what NATO really wants is, is to turn this. The question was, they're talking about producing all these weapons and ramping up production, and right away, Douglas Macgregor is like, well, the United States and NATO and Europe, they're never going to get to the capacity that Russia is. And why would that be? Well, I think it's important to note that the United States and Europe, their military industrial complex, is not organized around national defense. We need to get that out of our heads, that these countries have militaries that are about defending their nations or sovereignty or anything like that. They're not. They're not for that purpose. Their major purpose at this point is for profit. And the just-in-time system of distribution and allocation, and that is how these corporations, that's how they run. And the reason why the mainly privatized military industrial complex does that is because it's great for profits, because you can avoid the overproduction problem. Because, to be honest, while it's great to have a profitable center like Ukraine to dump weapons on, it's not necessarily profitable for these wars to continue to put pressure on production, when eventually governments, especially the United States government, has its limits. It can't continue to funnel wars into active military weapons, into active military conflicts. It will eventually drain the capacity of these weapons manufacturers, which don't want to do things that a lot of corporations don't want to do, which is have so many factories, have so many workers. That's what we're seeing, is that this military industrial complex is not able to keep up with Russia, because Russia has a definitive reason for ramping up its military. It has a real reason. That reason is not for profit. It's not just to make money. It's not just to get rich. And it's not about hedging how you can get rich in the most stable position possible, right? It's not just about dumping weapons on a proxy war. It's actually about defending national sovereignty, defending self-determination, and moving forward on goals that are beneficial to Russian society as a whole. That's a big difference that is making, I think, a huge impact on how this is all going. And so immediately Colonel Douglas Macgregor says, no, this is ridiculous. And it's also ridiculous to even think about manpower. Some of this reminds me of old conflicts in the past, where the United States thought that whatever it did, whether it's through proxy wars, whether it's through outright invasions, whether we're thinking about Iraq, Afghanistan, or even Central America, even Vietnam, Korea, where it thought whatever we do, whether it's by proxy or full-scale invasion, it's going to work and we're going to win. And here, what we're seeing, what Douglas Macgregor is stating, is that actually Russia has a lot of people who are willing to fight. Russia, in my opinion, doesn't want to send them out there, but Europe and the United States will never have the kind of force to take on the Russian army, the Russian military, which wants to defend its sovereignty. Again, this goes back to, in my opinion, the political will as well, and the political interests that are so divergent. The United States and NATO have interests in destroying Russia and destabilizing Russia and doing it via proxy war. And if a hot war happens, then a hot war has to happen to achieve that. But Russia, on the other hand, doesn't have expansionist dreams. All it wants is its territorial integrity, its sovereignty respected, and it believes that a culturally that there's this part of Ukraine that is culturally specific and very related to Russia, very connected to Russia, needs to be defended now after 7+ years of being shelled, attacked, and assaulted by honestly far right fascist, outright NAZI nationalists. That's kind of the crux of what we're really needing to understand about this war. But let's continue.
I mean, stop and consider that. They're not even facing the body of the force that's on its way to them at some point, and they're falling apart.
So the 200,000 then in southern Ukraine, you talk about this 200,000 that Jens Stoltenberg said last night, that Putin is mobilizing this additional 200,000 for this new invasion to topple Ukraine, and he won't stop, warns the NATO chief. He's not going to stop. So this new mobilization,
he's not going to stop until the Ukrainian forces are destroyed.
Right.
That was made very, very clear early on. That's the threat to Russia. And of course, we keep calling this an invasion. In reality, this is a counterstroke. He's responding to the threat that metastasized in eastern Ukraine, designed to destroy Russia. We're talking about defeating Russia, humiliating Russia, dismembering Russia. Good Lord, I'm surprised he hasn't simply declared war at this point and mobilized millions.
That's a really good point. I mean, this is coming from Donald Trump's national advisor to his National Security Council, to his Pentagon DOD. This is not coming from someone, it's not like Donald Trump's administration was about peace. But on this question, I think Donald Trump's administration did understand that Russia was absolutely not a force that could be reckoned with, that there needed to be some kind of détente. In my opinion, some of that, if not a lot of that, had to do with trying to actually build up the United States' capabilities toward China. And I thought, I totally opposed that, and I still oppose that to this day. But nonetheless, there was a different strategy with the Trump administration. Biden's administration is total all in against both of these countries, right? And I think that marks a big difference. Now, you could argue that Donald Trump's administration, certainly in terms of policy, did escalate toward Russia. You could say that in terms of policy, there's very little difference. But in terms of approach, politically, there is a difference. And here you're seeing some of the realism that can come out of that difference, in that, that we shouldn't even be talking about this, because Russia could be and should, honestly, Russia should have, if it were thinking just in terms of its own interests and just thinking in terms of what's good for itself, or even just rightfully and understandably responding to this threat, Russia would be doing way more than what it's doing now. It would be in an all-out war, because that's what the provocations, that's how significant they are. I think people tend to minimize what kind of damage the U.S. and NATO did for that 7-year period, 8-year period during the coup, right? Facilitating that coup in Ukraine, and then everything that happened afterward. There's a huge minimization. Liberals love to do this. Neocons love to do this. It seems like the entire establishment love to do this. They love to say Russia's unprovoked. Russia didn't have any reason for this. And then when you actually look at the history, you see that, in fact, Russia was being provoked and threatened. Heavy shelling, heavy, just absolute assaults right on its borders. Not to mention the fact that since 2015, when Crimea admitted itself into the Russian Federation through referendum, Ukraine has done everything to say, we're going to get you back, and has been militarizing for that point, for that time, for that conflict. So indeed, actually, Russia had a lot of reasons to feel provoked, and NATO encirclement being the big one, but also even just what was happening on the ground right across its border in East Ukraine was enough. And I believe it's enough now that I have understood. I didn't quite understand this when it first began, but now I understand just how devastating it is to watch thousands of people die who are related to you in many ways, in terms of nationality, we could say culture, but really just in terms of history. I can't imagine. I think there's a reason why Putin and why many Russian officials say that it was a huge mistake not to do something about this earlier, that was a big error that they're trying to correct right now. So let's continue for a little bit longer.
Right. Well, you have then, I want to put up this quote by Steve Bannon because I think it's certainly when we talk about Crimea, right? So this is what we've been hearing from the intelligence chief in Ukraine, as I mentioned at the top, that now the Ukrainian intelligence is saying that Crimea will be retaken by Ukraine. And here's what Steve Bannon said: the globalists with the Biden regime leading have taken the war from defend Ukraine to liberate Crimea, after $100 billion and losing a third of the country to the Russian army. So now this is the new message: liberate Crimea, forget defend Ukraine. Is that what we're starting to see now more? This talk is that's the new mission?
I'm beginning to think that there was never much coherent strategy to begin with, other than we're here to hurt Russia. I mean, that's essentially what we were told. This whole thing has become incoherent now.
Right.
The notion of striking at and liberating, as they say, liberating Crimea is a bunch of nonsense. It's all crazy. And I'm afraid what the Russians are discovering is the only way to put an end to this nonsense is for them to commit 100% to the destruction of the Ukrainian forces and ultimately to the elimination of this regime in Kyiv. Now, they're going to do that. But instead of seeing this sort of massive blitzkrieg that we're accustomed to because of the experience with the Germans in World War II, I think you're talking about 3 or 4 axes where you have effectively meat grinders on each one. Imagine bulldozers that are just moving forward, steamrolling what they find in their path until ultimately everything is gone. This is going to take a little longer, but the Russians want to be absolutely certain that they've annihilated the enemy. That's what we're going to watch. I also think the Russians are very concerned about our impulsiveness. We're in no position to interfere with what they're doing in Ukraine. And this is the reason I wrote this. Again, people need to be warned. This regime in Washington is amateurish. They're ideological and amateurish. They don't really understand what they're up against. They never did. They miscalculated when they thought, well, the Russians are weak. See, they didn't come in there gangbusters the way we would. Well, of course they didn't, because they were dealing with brother Slavs. They didn't want to kill Orthodox Christian Slavs. They were trying to find a way around it. When it became clear there was no alternative, that's when everything changed. So you're going to see the giant meat grinders show up and crush whatever is left in that country. But the more we talk about lashing out, the more we talk about, quote unquote, liberation or removing Putin or these kinds of things, the worse it's going to get. We got to get out of this business and start coming to terms with reality. But reality is not very popular in Washington.
So I do want to say, and that's all we'll play because I think that's enough. One thing that I do want to say, a disclaimer here. I think what Colonel Douglas Macgregor said about what Steve Bannon had to say, this is my problem with, I have a lot of problems with people like Steve Bannon because I don't think that Steve Bannon is how should I say, a good faith actor, if you know what I mean. I don't think he is. I think that's, Steve Bannon is an opportunist. I have big problems. Big problems with his politics for sure. But what I want to say about Macgregor's response to Steve Bannon is that I think it was pretty masterful because he didn't fall into the bait, which I think a lot of ideologues on all sides of the spectrum, right? This is true of the liberal class just as much as it's true of people like Steve Bannon, is they tend to just say things in order to and then act like it's the truth, right? So for example, when he said, the US's goal now is to liberate Crimea. Well, actually, what Colonel Douglas Macgregor said is the strategy is not so cut and dry. It's giving a little too much credit to both an administration, and I believe a political system in a military apparatus that doesn't really have that kind of plan. And I would say that this would be true under a Trump administration or any other administration at this current juncture, because in my opinion, This goes beyond politics. This goes toward the heart of what the empire is all about, what the United States, what the neocons are all about. It goes to, it goes to what their ultimate agenda is. It's not about just it's not just about their, how they talk about things and how they pursue their policies rhetorically, but it is about what's in front of them, what's the reality in front of them, and how does that correspond with their capabilities. And right now, I think Colonel Douglas Macgregor is 100% correct on this question of Russia when it comes to Russia's offensive, when it comes to NATO's capabilities, in that he is correctly deducing and concluding that Russia, in fact, has the upper hand. NATO does not have the upper hand. NATO is in big trouble here. The objective that Russia is pursuing is going to succeed so long as Russia is able to continue to move forward and continue on with its overall mobilization into an offensive, into total victory and final victory. There's nothing on the game board that says otherwise, because you have Russia with its mobilization, with its troops, with its 24/7 military industrial complex, which really is mostly state directed. So much different than the United States, which doles out tens of billions to private military contractors who then say, okay, we'll dump the weapons. But guess what? There's going to be no proper training. There's going to be no real plan behind it. That's up to you, officials and administrators and, commander in chief, Lloyd Austin, do your thing. But those forces don't really know how to go about this because they have met their match. I think that's the biggest point here, is that there's going to be no liberate Crimea. They're not going to be. You hear the United States talk out all sides of its mouth. They say, right, Biden says, I'm warming up to Ukraine being able to strike Crimea. And then he says, well, I don't think Ukraine will ever be able to militarily succeed in any kind of offensive that includes trying to retake Crimea. So what does that tell you? That tells you, well, there isn't really a strategy. So Colonel Douglas Macgregor didn't fall for the Steve Bannon bait there that was laid, which was, okay, I'm going to say something and you think it's reality. No, what the reality is that there isn't a real hard and set agenda beyond weaken Russia, destroy Russia, contain Russia, destabilize Russia, balkanize Russia. Those are the ultimate goals. They're all a different iteration of the same objective, which is to take Russia to its knees. But the joke has been on the collective West because they're not on their knees. Russia is not on its knees. Russia, in fact, is standing very tall right now. And this is frightening and scaring the neocons. It is causing a panic that seems a little bit muted because they have to put on a face. They have to act like everything is okay. They have to make comments about a spring offensive, while at the same time you have neocons like Victoria Nuland saying, well, a spring offensive may happen, but it's not going to include our tanks. So you have all these red flags, which may point to a different agenda. In my opinion, I think what's actually happening and what could be happening behind the scenes is that they're getting ready to fortify and militarize a partitioned Ukraine so that they can continue the onslaught against Russia in a more manageable way, which includes mobilizing NATO allies. I think Poland, you heard Douglas Macgregor talk about Poland. I think Poland is key here because they are right now probably the most anti-Russia, rabidly anti-Russia force in NATO. They have a very, I think, sadistic and problematic government. You remember the former PM who made the comment about Nord Stream, right? Thank you, USA. This force in Poland, they do have aspirations of maybe occupying Ukraine, maybe taking things in their own direction. And Poland tends to be, I think, the most supportive in trying to do whatever it can to weaken Russia. And that, of course, is, I think, maybe part of why the United States is making commitments that don't make any difference on the battlefield, because perhaps the strategy is changing. So Douglas Macgregor's words here need to be heeded because they are the truth about the military situation, which then informs this political situation of why the United States and NATO are not just failing, but now they're panicking about their failure. And that will lead to, I think, just a further indication that should tell us that Russia is indeed in the driver's seat now and could indeed. I think I've seen some people commenting here that Russia in the spring could go on an even more major offensive than even what it is doing right now. I consider it an offensive because I think it's always going to be methodical. I don't think Russia has shown any indication that it's just going to, run Ukraine over. But if circumstances change, if the spring comes and Ukraine tries something, Russia is now prepared, and it's indeed showing that it is prepared. It has all of these troops, it has all of this military hardware ready to go should the Ukraine try to wage some kind of last-ditch spring offensive. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to go well, as things are already not going well. But we will have to keep abreast. We will have to keep paying attention to this as we hit this 1-year anniversary of the proxy war in Ukraine. We'll have to definitely keep our eyes on this because it's going to get really interesting, I think, really fast.